Hi, my name's Amelia Chapman and I'm the Local Government Program Manager at EcoBuy. I'm really pleased to be part of the International Green IT Week and in particular to be able to deliver this presentation from our offices here in Melbourne, Australia. This virtual event truly is a demonstration of green IT in action and I'm really pleased to be involved. Now, broadly speaking, most people are now aware of the environmental impacts of the IT sector, but translating this understanding into green procurement outcomes is a different task altogether. Today, I'm going to introduce you to some of the key strategies and tools to help you and your organisation get the outcome you want from your purchasing. Just a quick note before I get started, there is a PowerPoint that accompanies this presentation. As we move through, I'll indicate the next slide by stating Q slide and then the slide number, so you can stay with me as we go along. And as a first practice of these instructions, Q slide 2. So just a quick overview of what I'll be covering in the next half an hour or so. I wanted to tell you a little bit about EcoBuy and also some of the key environmental impacts of the ICT sector. So why would we do green IT in the first place? Also defining what green procurement means to us at EcoBuy, and then to get into some of the tips I have for you to get started on greening your procurement. We should finish up with some time at the end for some questions which I'll be available online to answer. Q slide 3. So EcoBuy is an independent not-for-profit organisation based in Melbourne. We originally started as a local government program around 10 years ago and now work with both the business and government sectors to help them supporting organisational green purchasing. We consider ourselves a centre of excellence in green purchasing, and under this umbrella we undertake a range of activities including research, such as the recently launched Green Purchasing in Australia report. We also do consultancy, and we're also a training organisation where we can develop customised training options to help organisational change and development. We also have an online database called EcoFind, and this is where we've accessed reviewed supplier claims against our criteria, and you can search it readily for genuine green suppliers around Australia. Q slide 4. So what do we mean when we say green procurement? Typically procurement's an activity that's undertaken to fill the need for goods and services, and traditional criteria used when making procurement decisions include price, quality, fitness for purpose and availability of supply. Green procurement is about including environmental and sometimes social criteria into this decision-making process. This forces greater transparency between suppliers, business operations and customers, which in turn can result in product innovation or an environment for innovation, as well as behavioural change and ultimately greater use of resources and less waste. At EcoBuy, we define a green or environmentally preferred product as those that are less damaging to human health and the environment than competing products and services. And that serve the same purpose. And sort of embodied in this definition is the concept that every product has an impact on the environment. There's no such thing as a truly green product. However, there are choices available that have a lesser impact, and progressive organisations are making sure that they use their procurement spend to drive better financial, environmental and sustainability outcomes. Q slide 5. So I don't want to go into the environmental impacts of IT too much, as I'm sure that these will be covered in other presentations. However, I think it's useful to highlight that the environmental impacts are a lot broader than just energy use and climate change. Office equipment can contain a range of hazardous substances, things like brominated flame retardants, which are used in printed circuit boards, cable wires and plastic casings for computers. BFRs can affect learning and memory function in humans, and it can be attributed to off-gassing of equipment. Mercury, which is sort of widely recognised as being toxic to the nervous system and in high doses especially, that can be found in things like flat panel LCD displays and batteries. Other toxic substances include lead, cadmium and polyvinyl chloride, and incorrect disposal of these products can lead to dangerous toxins being released into the environment, and this can be both harmful to human health and the ecosystem. Some countries now have legislation in place, such as in the EU with the restriction of hazardous substances, or RODS directive, and that sets a minimum standard for the inclusion of such substances in equipment. These directives do go a long way to ensuring that the ICT industry is low impact in terms of its toxic substances. However, in the absence of a specific legislation like here in Australia, we're reliant on the efforts of manufacturers. Therefore, it's really important that purchasers identify and build in conditions in their specifications to limit these substances where possible. A very real concern for the ICT sector is supply chain resilience in the face of increasing resource scarcity, and this shortage has been driven on two fronts. Firstly, the fact that governments in industrialised countries are restricting the issue of permits for more mines, and that's mainly due to competing land use and sort of increased realisation of the impact of mining. And also the fact that we're simply running out of resources. They're becoming more scarce. Peak oil as a concept has had a lot of press, but what about peak copper or peak zinc or peak gold, for example? It sounds a bit far-fetched, but nearly every commodity group is experiencing some supply issues for a host of reasons. And if you add it all up, it all means potential supply shortages in the future. Cue slide 6. So my first tip to try and mitigate some of these environmental impacts and create a sustainable supply chain is to use eco-labels to assist you in identifying genuine green products. Now, eco-labels can be a great shortcut to identify a green product, and unlike some product areas, there's actually quite a few eco-labels and standards that exist for the IT sector, so you're quite lucky there's some of that work's being done for you. Now, although eco-labels are generally a good way to ascertain the green credentials of a product, it's worth noting that they're based on a broad range of assumptions and methodologies. For example, Energy Star is quite a widely known eco-label, and any equipment, computers, monitors, imaging equipment that has the Energy Star logo, they have energy saving modes that enable them to progressively power down. Energy Star doesn't tell us anything about other environmental impacts, such as whether it's got hazardous materials or comes from a recycled source. Rather, it focuses squarely on energy efficiency. So it's also worth noting that as energy efficiency in electronic equipment improves, so does the Energy Star program specifications, which are periodically reviewed and tightened. So if you're using Energy Star as a specification, ensure that you state that you're after the latest version, so that you're complying with the latest innovations and energy efficiency availability. And in total, Energy Star equipment can use between 30 to 60% less energy, depending on the level of energy saving mode that's enabled. So it is a good eco-label to look out for and quite commonly known. Cue slide 7. Now, another standard is the Electronic Product Assessment, Environmental Assessment Tool, also known as EPEAT, and this is developed by the United States Environment Protection Agency. EPEAT is one of the most comprehensive environmental standards for computers and monitors, and in addition to energy efficiency, it covers 23 required criteria and 28 optional criteria, ranging from the restriction of hazardous substances and design for environment to the ease of end-of-life disassembly. Now, depending on what criteria is met, the product will receive a rating of bronze, silver or gold. And just note that EPEAT is product specific, and what I mean by that is that a single manufacturer may have a product that is EPEAT gold, silver, as well as unrated products. So it looks individually at the piece of equipment you're looking at, not necessarily just at the supplier. EPEAT is a requirement for all US federal purchases, which is a great initiative and something we'd love to see here in Australia. But as well as being used by government, it's been picked up by the education, healthcare and enterprise purchases worldwide. And they claim that there's more than US $65 billion worth of procurement through the EPEAT scheme, which is quite an achievement. Although not a requirement in other countries, purchasers in 41 countries around the world, including Australia, can use the EPEAT standards and evaluate, compare and select products that are available to them locally. And EPEAT's ratings and criteria can be specified in contracts where local suppliers have registered with EPEAT. They have a handy international webpage, which I've included in the PowerPoint presentation. Cue slide 8. So a useful standard that may be of interest to our Australian audience is the Good Environmental Choice Australia product standard for computers. And products that are certified with the GECA label have been independently tested and demonstrate compliance to the environmental and social performance criteria detailed in the standard. And again, it's quite holistic. It looks at the whole life cycle of the product. There's also a standard for IT services developed, which can assist procurers to select green data management and internet service providers. So it goes beyond just looking at products and starts to look at green suppliers. Cue slide 9. So being aware of what eco-labels exist is a good first step to greening your contracts and tenders. However, key things to look out for with eco-labels are those that are based upon reputable, relevant and publicly available standards, and where holders are subject to regular conformance assessment by an independent auditor. Another consideration is that there are many eco-labels I haven't mentioned here, such as the Nordic Swan and Blue Angel. So I'd advise you to do a bit of research and find out what labels apply in your local area. Also, specifying that suppliers comply with a certain eco-label can sometimes lend itself to favouring larger manufacturers who can afford to undertake the sometimes expensive business of verification. So using the criteria that leading eco-labels set is one way to get around this and still get the outcome you want, and not excluding those smaller suppliers from your supply chain. Obviously, using this approach will involve a bit more research on your part when drafting the procurement documentation. Okay, cue slide 10. So my next piece of advice for purchasers is to consider the life cycle of products when developing contracts and requests for quotes. Using life cycle thinking assists you to identify at which point in the product's life cycle the biggest environmental impacts have occurred, which in turn allows us to target our criteria to maximise the outcomes we want and avoid the impacts we don't want. The diagram here demonstrates the various stages of a product's life cycle. All products begin as raw materials, and the environmental consideration at this point is whether those raw materials are readily renewable and how much energy or fuel is required to extract those materials from the earth. Sourcing products that are made from recycled or reclaimed materials have a lower embodied energy, and as it avoids the need to source and extract virgin materials. So it's something to consider in terms of trying to lower your life cycle impacts at this point, is if there are recycled or reclaimed materials which can be used or sourced. An emerging area for office and IT equipment is the use of cornstarch and biomaterials for equipment casing by some manufacturers. So while this is still yet to take off, it does demonstrate the lengths that some manufacturers are going to source readily renewable resources, and I think we're going to see more of this as resource scarcity becomes a bigger problem. The next stage to consider is when you process those raw materials into a usable form, and key environmental impacts here include energy and water use, as well as chemicals and anything you need to manufacture those raw material into the end product. What air and water pollution and discharges find their way into the watercourses and the environment at the other end is also a consideration, things that can threaten both human health and the environment. Considerations at this point are whether the manufacturer has an environmental management system in place, and this could range from a waste reduction program to purchasing renewable energy to offset their emissions, to having a full ISO 14001 accreditation. So it's worthwhile asking about the manufacturing process and what lengths and measures they're taking to reduce their environmental impact at the factory door. Manufactured goods are then packaged and transported to their point of sale, and it's useful here to consider whether the manufacturer has made attempts to reduce packaging and whether the packaging itself is able to be recycled. At every point in the life cycle, transport is involved, and obviously products that are manufactured locally are likely to have a smaller distribution footprint. However, transport emissions can be relatively insignificant compared to other parts of the life cycle. For example, with paper manufactured in Switzerland, even if it is a recycled source, they're nearly on 100% renewable energy. So it's going to have a lower embodied energy from that manufacture than something that's produced here in Australia, where our energy mix is from brown coal. So, when looking at the life cycle, it's worth considering the energy used in production, as well as how far it's come when weighing up, the biggest environmental impacts. Now, once you have the goods, it's useful to consider the costs and impacts associated with the use of the product, the energy and water you use to operate the product, the types of consumables, such as paper and toner, whether the parts can be replaced or upgraded, all have an impact and a cost attached to them. Often a product that is more expensive up front will actually save you money in the long run on operating costs. And I'm going to talk about the total cost of ownership a little bit later on. The United Nations Environment Programme estimates that up to 50 million tonnes of electronic waste is generated globally each year. And this is in part due to the high level of obsolescence in the IT sector, where the useful life of equipment is generally around 3 to 5 years. Other considerations include the design of equipment, so how easy it is to upgrade parts and components. And increasingly, manufacturers are offering take-back options where they recycle and reuse a proportion of the disposed product. This concept is known as extended producer responsibility. In Europe, at least 75% of e-waste is recycled thanks to the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, known as the WEEE Directive. This directive imposes the responsibility of the disposal of waste electrical equipment on the manufacturers of equipment. And in Australia, environment ministers from each state and territory have agreed that a similar national product stewardship scheme is the best way forward for Australia. And hopefully there'll be something in place in 2011. Unfortunately, it has taken a long time for Australia to get on board with EPR, and so in the meantime, specifying suppliers take back and recycle equipment and verifying that they indeed do that in a responsible way, it's one of the ways organisations can ensure the end-of-life disposal of equipment is sustainable. As you can see, there's a lot of things to consider when trying to choose the greenest option, and as I've already mentioned, there's no such thing as a truly green product. Every product has an impact at some point in its life cycle. The key is really looking to work towards buying the greenest option available. Cue slide 11. I wanted to show this graph to highlight it's important not to think of purchasing as the bit where you just order and pay for something, but rather it's a cyclical or systems approach to identifying, servicing and satisfying needs. And when you use this perspective, it's easier to see how both the procurement life cycle and the product life cycle for products and services require a strategic and systems thinking in both. For example, at the point of selecting a supplier, you have the opportunity to research green alternatives and incorporate these considerations into contract specifications. Likewise, developing and applying green evaluation criteria and weighting will ensure that environmental sustainability is at the heart of vendor selection. And it's important not to overlook the contract management stage as well, and ways you can ensure the sustainability criteria specified are active for the duration of the contract is to build in reporting mechanisms where the supplier can report back to you what they've been spending on green products, for example, any environmental benefits of their practice, the rates of recovery and reuse at end of life. And similarly, at the end of life, don't forget about the disposal of equipment. You can specify in your contracts that this is part of the contract management, that they take back and recycle that equipment at the end of its life. Cue slide 12. So probably the most effective mechanism you have to get the sustainability outcome you want is to use contract specification, and that's my third tip for today. I'm sure you've found with your own purchasing that the more specific you can be, the more likely you are to get the outcome you want. And we liken it to buying a sandwich. You usually get what you ask for, and once you've taken a bite, it's pretty difficult to change your mind. So if there's a particular ingredient that you're after or that you don't want, you need to communicate that to the person who's making the sandwich. And if they're business savvy, you can expect that they'll accommodate your needs pretty quickly, particularly if you tell them it's the only way that you'd ever buy a sandwich from them. So you can use specifications also to influence the whole life cycle of a product, as I've just discussed. So they can go a very long way to getting the outcome you want. Cue slide 13. You have the opportunity in your tender documents to ask about the product and the supplier's own internal processes and system. So in the example provided here, the table on the left outlines specific environmental requirements related to the purchase of copy paper, such as being recycled, no chlorine bleach, and that's where you can be very specific about the product being supplied. The table on the right asks for evidence of environmental management systems, policies and initiatives being undertaken by the organisation to minimise its own environmental impact. And this is where you can be specific about the supplier's own environmental performance. This is sometimes done through an environmental questionnaire that's included in the tender document, which can be weighted separately in the evaluation criteria. Cue slide 14. Another common approach to specifications is to use minimum environmental performance criteria as mandatory specifications and best practice performance criteria as desirable specifications. This case study from Victorian Government is a good example to illustrate this point. The tender is for the supply of multifunction devices, and note that this set of specifications have been phrased as mandatory, so things like having Energy Star or duplex capability, and the list goes on. And it's important that adequate market research is conducted when using mandatory specifications to ensure that the market is able to deliver what you're specifying, keeping in mind that suppliers who don't meet these specifications are not evaluated or eligible in the tendering process. Cue slide 15. So using the same example, the specifications go further to list features that are seen as highly desirable, accounting for the fact that innovative, sustainable approaches may be in the pipeline but not yet in place. And this will use the use of these criteria will help in differentiating the best practice suppliers, and by definition, it's unlikely that suppliers will all be able to compete on this level. So consideration must be given to the fact that specifying best practice may incur price differential, and your tender question should clearly identify whether or not there's an allowable 10% price increase for products that meet this criteria, and whether you would consider upfront cost alongside ongoing savings that might be realised over the life of the product. This can be incorporated into the full value for money assessment and may mean that the payback over time warrants an upfront cost increase. Cue slide 16. So leading on from that, my final tip is to consider life cycle costing when making IT procurement decisions. I already touched on this briefly, however it's worth reiterating. Unfortunately, IT managers can sometimes be a bit guilty of not considering the full life cycle, such as energy use and costs associated with IT and office equipment, as these costs are not usually on their bottom line or factored for in their budgets. So typical costs associated with the IT and office equipment include the purchase price itself, but also the energy that's used by the equipment, consumables such as paper and ink, maintenance and the end-of-life disposal costs. Proper life cycle costing will take these into account at the purchase point, and the results can be used to justify the business case for products that might be a bit more expensive up front but will save you money in the long run. Cue slide 17. This case study by Mackay Regional Council in Queensland demonstrates this well. The council replaced 55 Pentium computers and 6 servers with 55 thin client terminals and blade servers at a remote site. They conducted an energy audit prior to the switchover, which allowed them to calculate that the new system used 30% less energy and therefore produced 30% less greenhouse gas emissions than the Pentiums. This saves them over $1,200 annually in energy costs alone. However, the benefits don't stop here. The new thin clients last a lot longer than regular computers and as they require less hardware and upgrades. And this means that there are less costs involved over the life cycle of the product if you take into account the fact they don't need to replace the equipment as often. Another benefit is that the servers were relocated to their main admin building, whereas before the switchover, the IT support staff had a 1-hour round trip each time equipment failed. The new centralised servers mean that faults can be detected sooner and remedied, leading to increased productivity and less downtime, with fewer trips out to the site itself. So despite a higher upfront cost for the new system, the Council could achieve significant savings in both time, money and greenhouse gas emissions when looking at the life cycle costs of the new equipment. Cue slide 18. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you've gathered a few ideas on how you can get the green IT outcome that you want. I'll be available to answer your questions for the next 20 minutes or so, and I'd just like to once again thank Computers Off and the other organisers of this virtual conference, and I hope that you enjoy the program over the next couple of days. My details are down on the last slide for any of those who'd like to contact EcoBuy about any of today's presentation. So thank you.